Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're dialing in from or calling in from. Thanks for joining me today for this Lunch and Learn session on more effective Agile leadership. I am Steve McConnell. I'm probably best known as the author of Code Complete and a more recent book, More Effective Agile. For this talk, the role I'm playing is CEO of Construx Software. The way I'm playing that role is in support of our SPEAR 2020 Lunch and Learn program. Back in 2009, during the Great Recession, we launched a SPEAR 2 seminar program which offered free training to laid off software workers. This year, during the coronavirus pandemic, we're offering these free Lunch and Learn sessions. And our hope is that this will help to create a community for software professionals who are working from home and give you something to talk about with your colleagues, teammates, and so on. We're going to continue these Lunch and Learns through the end of April. We've had really good turnout so far and a good participation in the programs. So please feel free to share the link to the sessions with your friends, and we'll continue doing these for the rest of this month at least, and then we'll see where we are at the end of that session or at the end of that period. For the talk today, I guess to be clear, this talk really focuses on you as the leader. If you are not actually the leader in your organization, this talk may not be of super high interest because it really is zeroing in on leadership issues. And the gist of the talk overall is that Agile work in most organizations sorely needs leadership. And it is imperative that if you are the leader in your organization or a leader in your organization, it is imperative that you actively lead the work that is going on in Agile development in your organization. We'll get into lots of detailed ins and outs about why that matters and how to do that. So the foundation of the talk is based on my company's work with companies worldwide. We've been working with companies on Agile implementations for more than 15 years now. It's also based on my experience working with leaders worldwide. And that includes executive and leadership discussion events such as our annual leadership summit. It includes the review process for my book, More Effective Agile, where I had active contributions from more than 300 reviewers. The vast majority of those were leaders in their organizations. And so that gave me a really interesting perspective on where leaders are coming from, in addition to the leaders that I had more direct personal contact with. So what I'd like to cover in this Lunch and Learn session is a brief history of Agile development. I promise this will be the briefest history you've ever seen. Then I want to talk about some common Agile pathologies that I've seen in working with leaders in companies. I want to say a little bit about the Agile ground state, because I think that the ground state of Agile bears significantly on what your role is as a leader of the Agile work in your organization. And then I want to spend the last part of the talk, which will end up being at least half the talk, what it means to actively lead Agile work in your organization. I should say there is an ability for you to ask questions through the chat functionality. So please feel free to type in questions along the way. When we get toward the end of the session, I will take a look at the questions and answer as many as we have time for. So let's start with that brief history of Agile development. So the Agile development really started in 2001, or at least by that name, it started in 2001. And what we saw is that initially we had some useful practices identified. As time went by, we got more useful practices identified. And at the present day, I think we've got quite a few useful practices identified under the Agile umbrella. At the same time, as the useful practices were coming online, we also saw an enormous amount of rhetoric that accompanied Agile development. And to be clear what I mean by rhetoric, I literally mean the dictionary definition of rhetoric, which is language designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect on its audience, but often regarded as lacking in sincerity or meaningful content. I think the sincerity is largely there, but I think sometimes the meaningful content is not there. I think one of the challenges with Agile development from the beginning has been the challenge of separating out what are the truly useful practices versus what is just the rhetoric that accompanies all this stuff. And that's going to be a theme throughout the talk, and I think is a theme for really a lot of the work that you end up needing to do as a leader that in many organizations is just not getting done. So this is your leadership context, is a context in which you have a massive amount of rhetoric, a significant amount of useful practices, but separating the two ends up being part of your job. So let's then turn to the section on common Agile implementation pathologies. And here I think this is just helpful in understanding, again, what your leadership context is. If we had a healthy Agile implementation, then your staff's interpretation of Agile would be aligned with your business needs. And so grammatically, we can show that as arrows that are pointed the same direction, where your staff's interpretation of Agile and the business needs are all going the same direction at the same time. And so everything looks good. What we've seen in terms of pathologies is one interpretation is that the staff's interpretation of Agile is actually different than what your business needs. A really common example is where the business has a need for predictability, but the staff feels like they shouldn't be providing predictability because they see that as some kind of clash with Agile values or principles or philosophy or something. And so the staff's interpretation of Agile ends up going a different direction than the business needs. And that's problematic because the staff is at this point not supporting the business as well as they could. Their implementation of Agile is not supporting the business as well as it could. A second pathology is that the staff itself is not aligned. There are lots of people. They have lots of different interpretations of Agile. The interpretations vary. They support the business needs to varying degrees, but they are not aligned. They are going in lots of different directions. And so this is problematic as well. Pathology number 3 is that your staff actively disagrees with one another about their interpretations of Agile. The staff spends time arguing about Agile and about Agile philosophy, what we here at Construx would refer to as beer and philosophy conversations, instead of doing active work that moves the business forward. Pathology number 4 is that your staff agrees in a general vague way with the Agile direction, but they don't really understand the purpose or details or how it supports the business. And so this supports the business to a degree. It just doesn't support it nearly as well as it could. Pathology number 5 is that your staff agrees with your Agile transition and they agree with the business direction, but they're overconfident in the Agile skill set. And we see this a lot where when teams have mainly learned about Agile practices by watching YouTube videos or reading short blog articles, they might think that they know a lot more than they do about their Agile implementation. And so again, their ability to truly support the business as effectively as they could is limited. Pathology number 6 is that your staff says it can't do Agile unless the whole organization goes Agile. So this is basically just sitting down on the floor and refusing to move unless the whole business moves with them. And I hate to think that this even happens, but we've seen it happen in multiple organizations. And so this is problematic as well, and I think clearly calls for some leadership in helping the staff to understand why they need to be supportive of the business if they are actually going to continue to work in that business. The final pathology, number 7, is that your staff adopts Agile culture or rhetoric without actually adopting Agile practices. We see this too, and I think this is a side effect of the ratio between the tremendous amount of rhetoric that has evolved over the years versus the I think, sometimes diminished set of useful practices. It's easy to get focused on the rhetoric instead of staying focused on the useful practices. And so this is a road that leads nowhere as well. And so we really need to get staff focused on the practices and the specific practices that are going to support the business. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. So I think that the reason that a lot of this stuff happens is because you're leading in a context, which obviously you lead in your own organization, but you're also leading in an industry. And that industry has a context that is not defined mainly by your organization. That industry context is defined by Twitter and by YouTube and Facebook and by blog feeds and Instagram and LinkedIn and Medium and all kinds of other sources. And there are lots of conflicting messages coming at your staff from these various social media sources. And I think for you to be effective as a leader, you have to consider not just what message you and your organization are giving your staff about your Agile implementation. You also have to consider what messages the industry is giving your staff about your Agile implementation or about Agile implementations in general. And because of the prevalence and the amazing volume associated with social media, it's really easy for your leadership voice in your organization to be drowned out by a louder social media voice, which is not necessarily going the same direction that you or your business need your staff to go. And so an effective leadership approach really needs to consider not just the fact that you're leading in your organization, but how do you account for and lead within that larger industry context where there is so much noise versus the signal that you're trying to communicate to your staff. So let's turn then to a little bit more detailed explanation about the Agile ground state and kind of what some of the effects are of this social media context that we lead in. I think that I'm going to assert, and I'll back this up, I believe that there's a software industry-wide mismatch between Agile practices, business objectives, and certain parts of Agile culture or rhetoric. And so stay with me a little bit through this explanation. There's this very interesting State of Agile report produced by CollabNet version 1 that took a look at how companies measure success with Agile initiatives overall. And in looking at this report, or this survey of how companies measure success, what jumped out at me was these really kind of make sense from a general business point of view. Do I want to measure customer or user satisfaction? Yeah, that makes sense to me as the #1 thing that companies measure. Business value? Sure, that makes sense to me too. It seems like a really good thing to be measuring. On-time delivery? Yeah, that's important. You know, companies live and die based on the commitments they make and the commitments they keep. Quality? Yeah, that always needs to be on the list, both as an end result, but also as an enabler of these other results. Productivity seems good. Predictability, sure. Steady improvement of our processes, yep. Visibility into the project, yep. Scope management, yeah. So this list looks pretty reasonable to me in terms of how companies measure success. Now, the same report also listed how companies measure success with individual Agile projects, and the list looks pretty similar. We've got customer user satisfaction, business value delivered, velocity, which is, I suppose, a cousin to productivity, budget versus actual cost, which is kind of a cousin to predictability. And then we get some more details about Agile specifics, plan versus actual stories, plan versus actual stories on release dates, and so on and so on. Again, you know, this list looks like a pretty reasonable list to me, and I'm not seeing anything that gives me any heartburn from my point of view as a leader in my organization, but I'm also not really seeing anything that would give me heartburn as an individual contributor in an organization. Now, the interesting thing about this is, so far up to this point, everything looks reasonable. Companies are measuring success at the overall enterprise level and also at the project level, kind of the way we would expect them to. So this same survey listed the top challenges that people see to adopting and scaling Agile practices. And the list of top challenges look like this. The #1 item on the list, make this big so you can read it, is organizational culture at odds with Agile value. Culture at odds with Agile values. Now, how can that possibly be? When we looked at our list of Agile, the success criteria for Agile initiatives, i.e. how the organizational culture gets expressed in terms of how they're evaluating Agile, this looks not only like good for the business, but pretty consistent with my understanding of Agile values. Agile is supposed to be focused on the customer and the user. You know, the idea 20 years ago when all this got started was it was going to be better focused on the customer or user than the prior approaches had been. So I don't see any conflict there. Business value, same thing. The idea 20 years ago was that we were going to pay steady attention to business value and deliver functionality in descending business value orders. So I don't see anything at odds there. As I go down the rest of the list, same thing. I don't really see anything here that's at odds with Agile culture. So this idea that organizational culture is at odds with Agile values, I don't know where that comes from, or at least I'm asking the question, where does that come from? Same thing at the project level. I don't see anything at the project level that looks to me like it should be at odds with Agile values. Everything here looks pretty darn reasonable. So I think this really creates the question of why is there a perceived mismatch between organizational culture and Agile values? And because the ways that the organizations are measuring success seem pretty aligned with Agile values. So I think the answer is Agile rhetoric. There are people on Twitter, and I would say social media in general, but I actually think Twitter specifically is the main culprit here. There are people on Twitter who are trying to be as radical as possible with Agile. Your staff is reading these people and possibly following these people instead of following you. And if you want to look at the examples, I think certain Agile practitioners are trying to see how far they can push the so-called Agile envelope, including getting rid of requirements work, eliminating design work, removing idea of estimates, eliminating management work and managers, budgets, deadlines, commitments, documentation, all gone, according to at least some people on Twitter. Now, your organization probably has its own opinions about how important it is to actually have defined requirements work, or to have predictability and estimates to go with the predictability, and the role of managers and so on. But if you're not actively leading on these topics, you are ceding leadership to the people on Twitter who have very strong opinions on these topics and who your staff is reading. And really, this again is part of your leadership context and the context in which you need to lead Agile work in your organization. So throughout the rest of the talk, I'm going to have a series of leadership reflections. And my question is, who is leading your software organization? You'll be honest with yourself. How actively have you been leading the interpretation of Agile in your organization? And have you led that actively enough so that it's actually you leading it rather than Twitter? And then the second question, the follow-on question, is, what do you need to do to take charge of the interpretation of Agile in your organization? And that, I think, will require active leadership on your part. I think as background here, I think it's important to understand that Agile development, which has been underway for about 20 years now, is what I'm going to call an enormous end space of technical and management practices, strategies, values, and philosophies. And I'm using that phrase end space deliberately, and I'll return to that in a couple minutes. But in your organization, the end space is way too large for any organization to possibly pick out all of the practices, strategies, values, and philosophies from that end space. So your organization is going to choose a subset that are either really well suited to your organization, or kind of well suited to your organization, or not very well suited to your organization. And so you're going to get support for your organization's business needs to varying degrees, depending on how well the Agile implementation that you're leading actually supports the needs of your business. And I think in this context, there are a number of things Agile development is not. First, it's not a 1 or a 0. It's not a binary property where you're either Agile or you're not. And we're seeing increasing occurrence of what I think of as Agile loyalty tests, where there are challenges to say, are you really Agile? Well, that implies that you're either Agile or you're not. And this is part of why I said Agile's an enormous end space. It's not a 1 or a 0. It's multidimensional. Similarly, Agile development is not a scalar property where you're more Agile or less Agile. It's not a one-dimensional number line where you can be more or less Agile. It's an end space, multidimensional space of practices and philosophies and strategies. And so where you choose to occupy your organization on that end space is not going to be amenable to some statement about we're more or less Agile. What really is going to happen is it's a better or worse fit for your business and your business's needs. And I also think Agile development should not be anchored by the 20-year-old Agile values or the 20-year-old Agile principles. The Agile Manifesto and the Agile values and principles served a useful purpose 20 years ago when they first came out. But I think what we've experienced, especially over the last 5 years or so, is a lot of organizations and teams feel like they are tethered to the 20-year-old ideas of these of the Agile Manifesto and the values and principles that go along with it. And as a result, they feel obligated to basically be locked in time back to a point 20 years ago, instead of taking advantage of all the ways that Agile concepts have advanced over the last 20 years. So it actually kind of drives me crazy to see presentations that start with a long explanation of the Agile Manifesto or the principles, or trying to go through some big interpretation of how the principles apply. Because why do we care? That basically amounts to saying, are you truly Agile or not, rather than are you employing these practices and approach and principles in a way that actually supports your business? And that really should be the test: is does it support your business, not are you being faithful to some 20-year-old expression of software development ideology? And sometimes I think when somebody like me comes out and says something like this and actually bothers to point out that there are various flavors of Agile, and you need to pick the one that's best for you. It feels like sometimes you get pushback that makes you feel like you're the one saying the emperor has no clothes. But I think there's a lot of commentary that implies that anything that has the word Agile attached to it is good, anything that doesn't is bad. But I think that's an incredibly simplistic view of the software development universe. And the reality here is that we need to be taking a look at what works and what doesn't. And so my encouragement here is to be an Agile heretic, be a little bit revolutionary. It's okay to say some Agile practices don't work, and it's because of the practices, not because of poor use of the practices. Some of the practices themselves are just not that effective. Lots of practices are effective, but that doesn't mean they all are. Some Agile practices work fine when they're used well, but they're hard to use, and they don't work well most of the time. This applies to some Agile practices as well, and it's okay to say that. I've seen newsgroup discussions, or including Twitter discussions, where someone will very tentatively criticize a practice, and then a whole bunch of people will pile on and say, no, this practice works great, you didn't use it right. And then the person will back off and apologize for having the wherewithal to, or the ego to possibly criticize an Agile practice. In some cases, those practices, based on our work with companies, are in fact practices that are hard to use well, that are not used well most of the time, that don't offer high value. And the person on Twitter should not be backing off. They should be actually saying, no, in my experience, this is hard to use well. We need to find practices that are easier to use well. And we need to do more of that. And I think there's some practices that get the Agile label that don't work most of the time. Other practices work great. That's not to say there's any general indictment of Agile here. And I think overall what we see is that the Agile toolbox provides some incredibly useful and effective tools, but this mountain of rhetoric that accompanies it gives rise to, I think, a failure to appropriately criticize practices that aren't working as well. And that's problematic. And part of your leadership role needs to be, I think, reflecting on the practices that work well in your organization and that don't, and communicating that to your staff, investigating that with your staff. So my challenge for you in a leadership reflection is, how can you model treating Agile as a set of technical and management practices whose properties can be understood in technical and management terms? Not treating this as though it's some sort of ineffable religious experience, but as a practical, business-oriented experience that's really grounded in business and engineering, management, technical practices. Think about that. All right, so let's then turn to the final section of the Lunch and Learn session for today, where we're going to get into some meat about what it means to actively lead Agile work in your organization. About 10 years ago, I gave a talk called Unbreakable Rules of Leadership, or of Software Leadership. And my rules look like this. Be sure you're going somewhere, make decisions in the face of ambiguity, put the organization first, be passionate about your company's business, become a student of communication, treat your staff as volunteers, and take responsibility. And in thinking about what it takes to lead Agile work effectively, I reflected on these 10-year-old leadership rules and thought, well, how many of these really apply to Agile work today? And I think the answer is basically all of them are important for Agile work. The interpretation of them, or the specific work that needs to be done in under each of these rules, I think shifts a little bit because of the industry context that you're leading in, but I think all of them end up being important. Some of them end up fitting very naturally with sort of the general industry currents of Agile. Some of them end up being something where I think you actually have to do some work and maybe swim against the tide a little bit to lead effectively and follow these unbreakable rules. So the first one then, in terms of an assignment, is really that first leadership rule, and that's be sure you're going somewhere. And I think the importance of that is that you have to define a clear vision, both for where you're going in terms of your day-to-day project work or release work. You also have to express a clear vision in terms of where you're going in terms of your Agile implementation. And I like the concept of commander's intent here. And the idea behind commander's intent, it's a military idea that because you expect communication to break down and people to have to improvise and make up their own minds, You want to give them a clear statement of intent so that as they end up making detailed decisions on their own on the ground, that decision making is consistent with the overall intent that you have communicated. And expressing commander's intent effectively includes publicly defining the desired end state and doing that with some amount of making that a vivid description of the desired end state, making it clear what you're trying to accomplish. You want to describe what the purpose of the change is. Why are you doing it? So that people can make decisions consistent with that. And then possibly, not always, but possibly you want to identify the key tasks that need to be accomplished. And what we end up with is, if we don't do this, we get people going in lots of different directions. If we do it well, we can get people who are quite well aligned with the direction that the business needs them to be going. So define a clear vision is part of defining where you're going. As I said, I think it's important to be specific about what your desired end state looks like. At the same time, it's important to not over-constrain how the work is performed. I think if you're over-constrained, and I think this is tough for leaders who come from a technical background. We tend to be pretty analytical. We tend to be pretty detail-oriented. We tend to want to dive into the details. But as a leader, what we really want to do is define the end state and then leave the detailed interpretation of how to do the work up to the people that we're leading. And I think command and control leadership is inconsistent with Agile practices, but it's also just not very effective management in general. And so I like this idea of commander's intent, both as a way to think about how to define a desired end state and lead, but also as a way to help us stay out of the weeds and not get too detailed in the leadership that we're providing our staffs. In the book, More Effective Agile, I have a number of key principles. And just for the record here, one of the key principles is express clear purpose with commander's intent. And my reflection question here is, how clearly have you communicated your vision for where you want to lead your organization? And specifically in terms of your Agile implementation, we can also apply that to other questions of how clearly have you communicated where you want to lead. And then the other key principle relevant here is manage to outcomes, not details. So the next leadership assignment, which is really the next leadership rule, is make decisions in the face of ambiguity. And I think this is something that software people with a technical background probably need to hear more often than people from other disciplines might, because we tend to be very detail-oriented, we tend to be very analytical. It's all too easy to be trapped in analysis paralysis. A lot of times a good decision now works better than a better decision a week from now. Not always, but sometimes. And so we need to develop the capacity to make decisions even when the situation is ambiguous, or maybe especially when the situation is ambiguous. This particular kind of ambiguity that I think comes up in Agile implementations is the ambiguity that is present in the definition of the word Agile at the industry level today. We have many, many voices trying to define what Agile means. A lot of those voices are potentially louder than the voices coming from your own organization. And so it's important that your clear vision is strong enough and clear enough to overcome the ambiguity that people are hearing about from the various industry sources that they're paying attention to. And a technique that we like for this, and that we've used with some organizations, is a notion of landing zones, which can be used to define an initial implementation of Agile and then also monitor an Agile rollout. And I'll give you just an example. This is by no means canonical. The specific details can and should vary depending on the needs of the specific organization. My goal here is really just to show you how crisply you can define what you mean by Agile and what success in an Agile implementation looks like for your organization, if you are up to that task. So in this example, we have a number of landing zones or criteria. One is to complete the Scrum role assignments by year end. And then for each of these criteria, we have a scale. And in this case, the scale is the % of staff informed of their Scrum roles. You'll notice there's an underscore on the staff. And that means that is a specifically defined term that is defined elsewhere. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And then we have different levels of goodness. So basically we say at the failure level, if we're below 75%, we're failing. The success level or the target is 85%. And then there's some additional value in getting up to 90% or 95%. The zone that we're really trying to manage to is this 85% to 90% zone, and more is better, but there's a point here where more is not necessarily better, and we're not even going to try to do better than that. And then the upside down triangle here just shows where we currently are. So this says right now we have less than 85% of staff informed of their Scrum roles, so we're not quite in the success zone on this. The next criteria in this example is to complete Agile training by year end. Again, we've got a definition of that as the percent of staff who have gone through the Agile training program. That's again a defined term because it has an underscore on it. We've got Scrum support in place by year end, and our measure for that is, or our scale for that is the percent of in-house coaches who have completed the Agile training program. And then again, we have numeric targets for all of that. And then the next criteria is adopt Agile release and gating process by year end. We're going to measure that by saying the percent of teams using the underscore release and gating process. And then the last one is executive leadership training completed by year end. And then we've got a defined term of executive leadership team members who have completed an Agile leadership workshop. Again, all defined terms. So just to give you an example of how one of these would be completed in detail. So the first objective is to complete Scrum role assignments by year end. And so our scale is the percent of staff who have been informed about their Scrum roles and team assignments by year end. The meter, the way we're going to measure where we are on that scale, is reports from Scrum Masters on a wiki. And then we've got our definition of staff. So our definition of staff includes software development, SDETs, content developers, product owners, interns, and leaders, and it includes headcount on board as of year end. So we have a very crisp definition of what we mean by staff, and then that allows us to provide a measurement on this scale and know what we're actually measuring and what we're talking about. And then we define the various levels. The survival level is 75%, minimum is 85, target is 90, stretch is 95, and so on. So we can get very, very crisp and very detailed about this. And the result of this is if we publish this, we're leaving the staff with no real doubt about what we mean when we say we're going to roll out Agile in our organization. They can see pretty clearly what we mean and the way that we're going to, and in fact, imply a plan about how we're going to do it. Now, this has to do with the initial Agile implementation. We also can use this landing zone approach for monitoring development work with an Agile focus on an ongoing basis. And so here you'll see the objectives are actually pretty different. And these look a lot like the objectives that came through in that CollabNet survey in terms of the objectives an organization would have. These are, again, specific to each individual organization and should be defined organization by organization, but this is just an example of how clearly you can define these terms. So we can define customer responsiveness as one of our objectives, and that's going to be defined as business days from ideation to production, and we set our targets here for what that means. And you can see here that, depending on what you're reading online, this could be very, very different time scale. If I'm going out and reading about how Amazon is pushing to the cloud 20,000 times a day, the idea that customer responsiveness means that I've got a minimum set or a target set of 135 days, that's a pretty different idea. And so, the value of defining what we mean in our company here, I think, becomes pretty clear. Business value of delivered work, how do we measure that? Well, in this example, we've decided that we're going to go through a t-shirt sizing exercise, and it's going to be the total number of large and extra large t-shirt value items per sprint. Do you have to define it this way in your organization? No, you can define it however you want, however makes sense for your organization, but this gives us a crisp definition that makes sense in this organization. Stakeholder satisfaction, we have that measured on 5-point scale. Quality, we're measuring quality in this example as a rework percentage. So how much time are we spending fixing stuff that we didn't get quite right earlier? And in this case, note the scale goes backwards, where a high percentage is bad and a low percentage is good. And then continuous learning. Personally, I think continuous learning should be a huge part of any Agile implementation. I think that gets neglected sometimes, but this gives us a measure of the number of sprint retrospective actions implemented per quarter. And this is a pretty good one to say, more is not necessarily better here. If we're just implementing a whole bunch of retrospective items and not making sure whether they work and not evaluating whether they really were an improvement or not an improvement, that would not be a good thing. But the thing we're measuring here is not so much process improvement as continuous learning. Are we at least trying things out? So again, in this particular organization, this was decided as the thing that was going to be a representative of continuous learning. I guess it also brings up the idea that this is not necessarily cast in stone. We can use this for a quarter. We can revise it, once a quarter or more often if we want to, less often if we want to. The point is, we're defining in super clear, crisp terms what success looks like for our development work with an Agile focus. There's not going to be anybody on our team who is saying, oh, customer responsiveness doesn't matter, we don't care about that, because this is stated very clearly. Customer responsiveness is one of a small number of objectives that we're actually managing to and monitoring. All right, so that basically is the end of my thinking, at least for this talk, on how we make decisions in the face of ambiguity. And hopefully you can see how we can be much, much clearer than this vague industry-wide definition of Agile with lots and lots of different opinions about what that means. We can define that in super clear terms for our specific organization. The next leadership assignment I have for you is to put the organization first and be passionate about your company's business. So in my 10-year-old talk on the unbreakable rules, these were 2 unbreakable rules. In this, for the purposes of leading Agile effectively, I think I want to combine these 2 rules into kind of a package idea. I think here, one key point is that Agile development is not a goal in itself. If we look at the results of that CollabNet survey, there's no goal here that says our goal is to do Agile development. These goals have to do with business outcomes. So your specific objectives, your business objectives are the goals. Agile development is properly a means to an end. It is not the end. And so my question for you, my encouragement in terms of reflecting on the leadership role you're playing in your organization is, does your organization exist to serve Agile practices and philosophy, or do Agile practices and philosophy exist to serve your organization? Now that's a rhetorical question. I assume the answer is the latter. But then the real question here, the real reflection here is, have you been modeling that in your leadership? Have you appropriately and strongly enough modeled the idea that Agile practices and philosophy exist to serve your organization? Your organization is primary. Agile practices and philosophy are in a supporting role. And then I think other reflections are, how much attention have you seen your staff pay to business focus, not just when you ask them about it, but if you are a fly on the wall listening to discussions, how much are they really paying attention to business focus of Agile versus how much are they applying kind of the Agile loyalty test of, are we really being Agile? If I hear a staff that is more often talking about, are we really being Agile? Are we being Agile enough? Instead of saying, does this practice really support the business as well as it could? Are we sure we understand what our business stakeholders' objectives really are? And are we really managing to that? I want to make sure that the staff is really focused more on the business focus than on Agile purity. And then I think the next question is, how much attention have you seen your staff pay to business focus in their conduct of Agile? So not just their discussions, but their selection of practice and their day-to-day and week-to-week conduct of Agile. And then finally, have you modeled that business focus in your own leadership? I do think leadership starts at the top. And so if you're not modeling that, then you're sending a message to your staff that says they don't really need to be implementing it either. From the book, More Effective Agile, the 2 relevant key principles here are develop a business focus, which I think should be clear at this point, model key Agile behaviors. And the one here that I think is critical is the idea of treating Agile as being in service to your organization, not the other way around. All right, the next leadership assignment is become a student of communication. And I think this is actually implied across all the other unbreakable rules of software leadership, but is definitely an important one. And I think if we look at the other unbreakable rules, be sure you're going somewhere. You have to communicate where you're going. Communicating where you're going is actually a really big part of that. Make decisions in the face of ambiguity. You have to communicate what the decision is. If you haven't communicated the decision, then you haven't really made progress against the ambiguity. Put the organization first and be passionate about your company's business. You have to communicate that you're putting the organization first and that you're passionate about your company's business. If you're not communicating that, then it's as if it didn't really happen. And we'll get to the last 2 points in a little bit. All right, the next leadership assignment for you is to treat your staff as volunteers. I think with some of these other unbreakable rules, we are swimming against the current a little bit in terms of providing that leadership in an agile context. This is one where I think the current is actually going the same direction that we need to go as a leader, which is, I think a lot of the discussion around agile really does amount to making sure that you show that you value your staff, that you value them as not just as workers, but as human beings, and then treat them accordingly. In the book, More Effective Agile, I talk about Daniel Pink's work on autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And the interesting thing, Pink's book is called Drive, and it's about the factors that lead to motivation. And the terminology may not be 100% intuitive. Autonomy is the ability to direct your own life and work. I think that's fairly intuitive. Mastery is used in a little bit of an unusual sense here. It's not getting to a static level of mastery of a topic. It's actually more of a dynamic concept of it being a desire to learn and improve on an ongoing basis. And then purpose is just understanding why what you're working on matters. And the interesting thing here is that if you look at the factors that make a highly motivated team versus the factors that make an effective agile team, the ideas of autonomy, mastery, and purpose really collectively make a highly motivated team. But there ends up being a lot of overlap between these two, and the factors that make an effective team in Agile are actually, and an effective Agile team that really is Agile, able to make decisions on its own, able to represent the interests of the business on its own, able to move quickly and flexibly. These are essentially the same factors. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose support all these common business objectives of having a lot of decision making push down to the team, having the team be able to move quickly without a huge amount of direction, so on and so on. So I think these are key ideas, and there's a lot of overlap here just between what it takes to motivate the team and what it takes to have them be effective from an Agile perspective. So the key principle here from the book is motivate your staff through autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And then the final leadership assignment here, at least I think it's the final one, is take responsibility. And this is one where I think when the early days of my company, and we've been around for quite a while now, in the early days of my company, we were kind of immature. And so we used to draw this stupid, smart continuum, and we would place ideas on this stupid and smart continuum. Because we've been in business for a long time, we've refined this model. So it's now a 2x2 matrix. We still have stupid and smart as some of the dimensions. And on the other dimension, we've got industrious and lazy. And what this says is that ideally, of course, we would love to have our teams or our individuals in the industrious and smart quadrant. If we have our teams and individuals in that quadrant, we're getting lots of work done and it's getting done well. If we can't have that, then if we have teams that are smart and lazy, we might not be getting as much work done, but at least the work is going the direction we want. The work is being done well. Stupid and lazy, we definitely don't want our teams in this quadrant because we're basically making mistakes and we're not getting a whole lot done. But what we really want to avoid at all costs is industrious and stupid. Because now here in this quadrant, we have people very actively doing work that we don't really want them doing. And so that's really what we want to avoid. Now, I've used the word stupid here, but really, I think more accurately, the word is misguided. And what does misguided mean? Misguided means the leader is not guiding the work as effectively as the leader should be. And so if you are not leading effectively, you could very easily have your teams in this quadrant of industrious, and misguided, meaning very rapidly making progress not in the direction you need them to be making progress. And so taking responsibility here for leading your team in the direction that you and your business need them to go is another important point. If you look at these top challenges to adopting and scaling Agile practices, I've removed the top one now about the cultural misfit. But if you look at the rest of these overcoming these challenges really falls squarely on the leader's shoulders. So general organization resistance to change, yeah, you as a leader need to take charge of that. Inadequate management, support, and sponsorship, again, that's a leadership activity. Lack of skills or experience with Agile methods, well, pointing your team at YouTube videos is probably not good enough. You need to actually make sure that your team is adequately skilled. They go through the training or the coaching or mentoring so that they become adequately skilled in Agile methods. Inconsistent processes and practices across teams. Within a team, you could potentially say the team's largely responsible, but when you get to across teams, now that becomes more of a leadership activity. Insufficient training and education. It's interesting to me that we've got both that one and the lack of skills and experience. I kind of see those as related, but the fact that it shows up on the survey essentially twice starts to tell you how important and how frequently missing that particular aspect is, that getting people adequately skilled in the work that they're being asked to do and the way they're being asked to do it is a missing link. And that's your job as a leader to provide that. And then lack of business, customer, product owner availability. Again, the teams can only do so much on that. This is more area where you as a leader really need to take responsibility for that. So the reflections here I have for you is, if your Agile initiative is not meeting expectations, how much of that can be attributed to your leadership? Is it really the team's issue, or is it really your issue as a leader? And then the other question is, what do you need to do to take responsibility for the effectiveness of Agile work in your organization? What do you need to do to lead more effectively? And I think because that idea of training and skills showed up so prominently on the list, I think a related question is, do your teams and individuals have the skills they need to perform the work? The high leverage roles, particularly Scrum Master and Product Owner, we see those as lacking skills in a lot of the organizations that we work with. We also see fairly often individual contributors not really being adequately skilled in how to perform the work of Scrum or Kanban or whatever Agile practices they're using. And we also have some more subtle variations on this, where it's not just the top line, the headline Agile practice, but there are supporting skills such as integrating, the slide says development into test. What I really mean is integrating the test activity into development. And have we adequately trained people in how to make that shift? And that's, I think, something that's often missing in the Agile implementations that we've worked with. And then I think final question, does your implementation of Agile practices support a continuous learning environment where the goal is not effective, but more effective? And I think, this really is, in my mind, this is the heart of Agile philosophy, is the idea that we are always learning, always paying attention, always trying to get better. And the goal is not to be good, it's to be better. And that, I think, gives rise to a lot of good behavior once we express that as the goal. So I think the key principles in this area are kind of a combination of the principles I've already talked about. Plus, in the book, I have a key principle called increase team capacity by building individual capacity. I go into a little bit of detail on that. Develop a growth mindset, I think, is a really important idea and leads to a lot of self-supporting behavior that leads to other good things. And then inspect and adapt. And I think that almost everything else in Agile can be inferred from these last two principles. If we develop a growth mindset or prioritize that as a leader, and we really instill the idea of inspect and adapt combined with the growth mindset, then I think our teams are set up to get on the path to becoming really, really effective. So what conclusions can we draw? I think we can draw a few conclusions. One is, you lead in both an organization and an industry. You need to consider both in your approach to leadership. Another is, I think that most Agile implementations are nowhere near as effective as they could be. And I think leading an effective Agile initiative requires active leadership in some unexpected areas, especially the definition of Agile and the purpose that Agile is intended to serve in your organization. And finally, I think general leadership practices matter as much as ever. This is not a time to focus just on the Agile details, but all those good general leadership practices matter a lot as well. Closing thoughts, we have more of these Lunch and Learn lectures coming up, so take a look at the schedule at construx.com/lunch. And if you like this lecture, I've got this series called Understanding Software Projects. This particular topic is not in that series, but I encourage you to check that out in our on-demand environment. And I'm going to take a look now at the questions and see what kind of questions we've got. We've got a couple minutes for questions, so let's take a look and see what we've got. All right, so it looks like the first question here is, can a challenge to Agile adoption be a result of selfish insistence to solely own a project or product absent contributions of others, or siloing? Yeah, I think Agile is at its heart a team sport. At least as I understand it, it's a team sport. One of the really important concepts of Agile is that responsibility really stops at the team, and inside the teams are supposed to be self-organizing or self-directing. And I think we get a lot of good things that happen when the team becomes the unit of responsibility. The team can make decisions that are locally sub-optimizing but globally optimizing if individuals are not being held individually accountable. We can, for example, say we're going to have this one particular person not really deliver very much this particular sprint because we need them focused on paving the way for some other work. And that might degrade performance of that person in terms of their measurable work, but it might increase the velocity of the team. So we can make decisions like that. And I think in general that is a healthy practice. We get the group mindset of the team supporting one another. And I like the concept of generosity, where when people are generous, they are willing to expand their area of responsibility and support one another. You start to look at the whole project as my job instead of some isolated task as my job. So yeah, I think siloing can be a challenge, and overly individual mindset can be a challenge. I talked in my book, Rapid Development, I talked more than 20 years ago about the fact that when projects are perceived as late or they're challenged, individual contributors kind of revert to what I've called solo developer mode, or isolated individual contributor mode. Their area of what they view as their responsibility shrinks down and says, no, I'm not responsible for that. That's your work, and this is my work. And I'm worried about being able to complete even my own work, so I'm not going to help you out with your work. And that's a destructive dynamic that leads to a downward spiral. Whereas if we get a team mindset established where, yeah, your primary focus is on one area, my primary focus is on another area, but if you need help, I'm going to help you because really it's our work collectively. I think that gives rise to a lot of good behavior that speeds things up and improves quality and so on and so on. Let's see. So it looks like we got one more time for one more question, I think. Okay, yeah. So this one is, there are many excellent long-standing practices that support business value, but often get pushed aside in Agile implementations because they were not labeled Agile. What recommendations do you have for leaders to help promote good practices in general rather than having Agile tunnel vision? Yeah, this is obviously a painful point for me, and I think a lot of what I said in the talk is really aimed at that particular issue. We've had an enormous number of practices and beliefs and principles labeled Agile over the last 20 years. The fact that something happened to predate Agile does not mean it can't fit very, very well inside an Agile implementation. And I think the reason that this happens, if I go back to the details of the question, long-standing practices that get pushed aside that are helpful in supporting business value, but they get pushed aside because they're not labeled Agile. I think what that speaks to in my mind is an organization or a team who believes the goal is to be Agile rather than believing that the goal is to use Agile practices to support the business. And to me, that sort of suggests a lack of critical thinking, which is the question is, how do we support the business? I don't really care whether the practices have been labeled Agile or predate Agile or are not Agile. I want to choose the practices that fit my business the best. I happen to think there are a lot of practices under the Agile umbrella that really do provide excellent support for an awful lot of businesses, but that doesn't mean there aren't other practices that can still provide support as well. And really this comes down to just a case-by-case decision, company by company, team by team, about how each company and how each team is going to be able to support the business best itself. I like the idea of landing zones for this. I think in the hypothetical that was given to me, I suspect that if the organization defined the landing zones very crisply along the lines that I described, that would give rise to a different way of thinking about, well, you know, are we going to include or exclude practices because they are or are not labeled Agile? So I think that's all that we've got time for today. Thank you very much for joining me for this Lunch and Learn. Please do check out the website and see the other Lunch and Learn topics we've got coming up. Please share this information with your friends and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.